Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I have been elected to kick things off. I'm Angela Rice. I'm the Ridgefield Joint Council of PTA's co-president. I helped plan this event a number of times before at Branchville, and I'm really excited for you all to get to experience it tonight. So this is a wonderful testament to our town. We have tons of parents on this call already, which is wonderful. We also have some RPS faculty and staff with us, including our superintendent. And I see at least 2 principals so far. So that's really wonderful. And we're grateful to have you all. I do want to just say a couple of words of thanks to the RHS PTSA and the Ridgefield Joint Council of PTAs who are co-sponsoring tonight's event, and also to the Ridgefield Library for their willingness to host us and record before we ended up pivoting to virtual. And now, of course, the roads are fine, but hopefully this has made it easier for some more people to attend. And certainly it's easier to record and share with others who couldn't make it. So that's, a silver lining, as we all learned during the past few years. So the format for tonight is pretty simple. We have some pre-submitted questions that some of you who are on the call may have submitted. And our panelists are going to answer those questions. And during that time, we're not going to have open discussion or Q&A, just to make sure that they get through the questions that were pre-submitted. Then after that, so that this part is being recorded. Then after that, when we switch to open discussion and Q&A, we will turn off the recording so everybody can feel free to share whatever they might want to share or ask whatever they might want to ask. If you do have a question that you don't want to ask, verbally, you don't want to unmute and ask, or you're in a place where it's loud or something, feel free to share in the chat. You can either share it to everyone in the chat, or you can share it directly to our moderator, Ms. Nero Feliciano, who I'll be introducing more in a moment, if you'd like to keep it more anonymous. Either way is totally fine. And let's see, I think that covers all of our logistics. So I just want to, kick things off again by thanking all of you for being here and thanking our wonderful panelists, Amy Julia Becker, Carrie Amos, Dr. Melanie Pearl, and Nero Feliciano. They are amazing. I'm so excited for you to hear from them. So I'm actually going to allow them to introduce themselves, and I'm going to just turn it over directly to Nero to get started.
Thank you, Angela. I just want to thank everyone involved in putting this together. And we were just saying before we jumped on the Zoom that I know personally, I feel very grateful to live in this town and to have a town that's committed to doing this work and educating each other in these conversations. And Angela's been a big part of this, not only in this event, but prior, where she began putting the word out about these conversations at Branchville. So thank you so much. It is really such an honor to moderate this. And I'm telling you that because the 3 panelists on this event are the 3 people I probably go to the most when I have tough questions that I need to answer, both for my clients, for myself, and for my own family. So Melanie Pearl, Carrie Amos, and Amy Julia are my go-tos. So I know the wealth of wisdom that lies within them, and I'm excited to hear what they talk about tonight. So I will just introduce each of you. Just a little about me. I am a cognitive psychotherapist. I've been in private practice in Wilton for 17 years now, and wrote a book last year. I do some media here and there, and just very happy to be here. I love Melanie is a child psychologist, and like I said, one of my go-tos. But Melanie, I'd love for you to say a little bit more about who you are and what you do and your kids in the school. I will say I have 4 kids in Ridgefield schools too, 2 at Eastridge, 1 at the high school, and 1 at Branchville. Go ahead, Melanie.
Thanks, Nero. Thanks, Angela. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and thanks to our sponsors. I'm Dr. Melanie Pearl. I am a child psychologist with a part-time practice in Ridgefield, and I do a lot of individual work with children, especially younger children, and I do a lot of parenting consultation as well. I am a parent to a son at the Ridgefield High School and a son at Eastridge, and a former Branchville parent. And we've lived in town for almost 15 years, I think.
Thank you, Melanie. I will introduce Carrie Amos, who also is a psychotherapist, and we work very closely together. Carrie, would you please say more about yourself and your family?
Sure. Thanks, Miro, and thanks, Angela, and everybody for being here. I am Carrie, and I have a private practice, part-time practice, and I also run a nonprofit foundation that's global, actually. And so I have a dual focus, and for me, working with individuals, the micro impacts the macro. So when I get to work with adolescents and adults, it gives me tremendous perspective for communities and towns and cities and states. I am your neighbor in Newtown, married with 3 children, all 3 in high school. I'll say that again, all 3 in high school. I have a senior, a junior, and a freshman.
Thank you, Carrie. A lot that I learned from you that I know we're going to all learn from you tonight. And Amy Julia is one of my longest friends. We've been friends since we were 14 years old, which is a long, long time, given how old we are now. And she's an incredible writer, an author of many award-winning books. And she was an incredible writer since she was about 15, as far as I can remember, and speaker. But Amy Julia, please say a little bit more about you and your family.
Yes, well, thank you. I would say similar things about Nero, who has also written a wonderful book and is just a wealth of, yeah, she's been providing me with therapeutic advice for 30 years now, so I'm grateful for that. And I live up in Washington, Connecticut, so not directly in Ridgefield, but not too far away. And I think if come from pretty similar communities. And I also have 3 children. Our oldest daughter has Down syndrome. She's 17. We have a 14-year-old son and a 12-year-old daughter as well. And I have been thinking about the relationship between disability and race and class and education and many of the different identity and social issues that are affecting our lives and our children's lives for a long time now. And I've written a couple of books on those topics. I also have a Master's of Divinity from Princeton Seminary. So there's a faith component to the work that I do. And I think a lot about kids and spirituality and the spiritual aspects of our lives. So those are some of the things that I bring to the virtual table.
Thank you so much. So we're going to jump right into these questions. They were great questions. And the title of this event is, do you have the tools to talk? And we're talking about mainly teens, but some of these topics and themes are certainly relatable to a younger population as well. And obviously, with that title, there's so many different things that we can talk about, but we are talking about some of the more difficult conversations as pertaining to race and identity and our relationships with each other. I did think it was good for us to just start off with connecting with your teen, because I think for many people, this ebbs and flows. I can say as therapists who all have teenagers, we ebb and flow in how we connect with our teenagers as well. Some days are good, some days are tough. But I think we can start off by talking about, how do we build rapport? How do we establish connection with our teens in a way where we can actually talk to them about the hard things? So Carrie, you have the most teenagers out of all of us. So I'm just going to start this one with you.
So I speak not only from the perspective of a therapist, but from a parent who's gotten it wrong several times over. And you'll hear me say this tonight a lot on most of the topics we're going to be talking about, empathy and listening. And so when I think about connecting with teenagers, it's so very different than connecting with little ones. Empathy, understanding and putting ourselves in their shoes. Our teens are facing things that we never had to face. We can talk about, I live in Newtown. I live in a minute from Sandy Hook. So we can talk about school crises. We can talk about just all of the choices that our kids are facing right now, particularly our teens. And so I have found, and I have shared with clients, that if we can empathize with them and begin to understand where they are and what they're going through, followed very closely by listening. For me, with my own teens, I have 2 daughters and a son. And for so many of my patients, if we can stop talking long enough to listen to what they're really saying and what they're not saying, that's a really good starting point for connecting with our teens. So those are the two things that I would recommend first and foremost. And this is for parents and for teachers and for educators alike. Listening and empathizing. We often just want to rush in and fix it or tell them what to do and fix it. And sometimes that's not necessary. Listening and empathizing.
Anyone want to add to that?
I have a little hack that I use with myself when I have to talk to my kids about things that I might be emotional about or they might be emotional about. I remind myself that I need to act like I'm having a transaction, like getting an oil change or buying new tires, or like something very neutral. And when I put that in my head, then I find that I can speak more neutrally and listen more neutrally to my kids than if I put in my head all the worries about saying the right thing and making sure they're, turning out to be respectful people and, just oil change. And then boom, then I can go right in and I can talk to them about pretty much anything with the oil change personality in mind.
I like that. That's helpful because some of the things really do elicit some deep emotions when it may be friends that you don't particularly want them to hang out with, or things that they want to do at the times that are most inconvenient, those types of things. I will just add to that we have to listen to the things that we're actually not interested in too. And I'm saying that in all honesty, just because I find that my kids, my teenagers, they talk to me at the most inconvenient times. And a lot of times, some of the things that they say, I'm not that interested in, but I recognize those are connection points. If I can put what I'm doing down and listen, and when Carrie says empathize, oh, that must have been really fun or really hard for you, or whatever it is, reflecting whatever emotion back and asking more questions. Tell me more about that. Tell me what happened. What was that like for you? Or that must have been really fun, whatever it is. Those types of statements can open up the conversation. And then just happen today. We have to get aligned with what's important to them. That might be for my daughter going to a SZA concert this week, which took me like a year to learn how to even say SZA's name. I'm probably saying it wrong. But then she's asking me about the eyeliner she's going to wear. And I don't care what eyeliner she wears. But I stopped and I said, what do you want to wear? Show me what it looks like. These are how we connect in these everyday ways so that we establish connection to then talk about the bigger things. Amy Julia?
The only thing I would add, and I'm the one who's not actually trained in, the developmental psychology of teenagers, but I will say that having lived among teenagers for a long time, because I live at a school, I do see these teenagers as times when it's actually natural and healthy for kids to be differentiating themselves from their parents and from their families. That doesn't mean they are distancing themselves. It doesn't mean that they are rejecting their families, but it does mean they need to discover who they are, both within their families, but also independent of them. And so there's for me, that can be encouraging that my role as a parent, this is always true, but it takes different shape, I think, during the teenage years, is to be helping them discover who they are, not helping them become who I want them to be. And over time, of course, we would hope that discovering who they are is who we want them to be. But that is a good reminder for me as a parent that my job is to help them discover who they are and to, especially during these years, allow them to be themselves, like to be different, and to even push some of those boundaries in a way that might feel like rejection to me, but might feel to them like learning that they can do things independent of mom and dad, or at least start to learn how to do that.
I love
No,
that.
if I could just add one thing, just to close the loop, Amy, Julia, you triggered a thought. Sometimes connecting, we've all been talking about what we're saying or how we're listening. And I have one child in particular that doesn't really want to talk to me or my husband, and would prefer to be gaming or prefer to be in his room or prefer to be anywhere but with me. And so sometimes connecting is sitting in the same room and watching a show together, or he's playing a game and I'm doing notes from a session that I had, and it's being in each other's physical space. And after several weeks of, okay, once a week, we're just going to sit together. We're going to sit together and watch this movie, or you watch your sporting game and I'm just going to sit here next to you, but I won't say anything. And after a few weeks, several weeks of doing that, he actually said, and he's 16, Mom, it's kind of cool sitting on the couch with you. And that was a huge win. And that's a connection. So it doesn't always have to be conversations and tell me how you're feeling and where do you see yourself in 10 years from now. Sometimes it's the physical connection of being in each other's space and it not driving each other crazy.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think that's more the case for many people who have kids that don't open up, and to find something that they enjoy doing and try and become a part of that, even if it means, like you said, just your physical presence, can be powerful over time. Yeah. I'm going to get into the questions. So the first question that was submitted was, why should we talk about race and ethnicity with our children? And how do we start a conversation about race and ethnicity? And I would like to actually start this one off, just being that Ridgefield is a predominantly white community. And although race and ethnicity touches most of us in some ways, for many of us, you can go throughout your life in this town without really developing an awareness of it. So especially for people who have children, you're raising in this town. I'd love to start with you, Melanie, to talk about this.
I love that you brought that up, Narelle, because I think the way, the reasons why I should talk to my children about race and ethnicity are different from the ways and the whys that some other people have for talking to their children about race and ethnicity. For my own kids, we need to be cognizant of our privilege and our biases, living in a town like Ridgefield, where we are, we're white, we're cisgender, which means I don't have children who at this point in time are questioning their gender identity. We're heterosexual, I'm married to a man. We're pretty white bread. And it's important for my particular children to acknowledge what that means for them in this community, and what that means for them when they leave this community, and what that means in terms of how they interact with other people. However, I'm not really having conversations with my kids about how to keep themselves safe in this community because of their race or because of their gender, because it's not something that we really have to think about. Whereas for a lot of families, it absolutely is something that needs to be thought about and talked about and taught. Narelle, you're muted.
Thanks, Melanie. Would either of you like to add to that?
I'm happy to add a little bit. I certainly agree with everything Melanie offered. And I would also say that, for those of us who identify as white and who have white children, and all of the different descriptors that Melanie just offered are true of me and my family as well. Although we do have a child with a disability. But I would say that our kids are forming identities as well. And they're forming identities in both certainly, even if it's not within a town that has a particular amount of diversity when it comes to race and ethnicity, they're certainly doing that within a state and a nation and a world that do. So there is a sense of, what does it mean for you to be who you are and to have an understanding of that? So there's just a identity formation question, I think, for all of us, where race and ethnicity is a relevant issue. there's a justice issue in terms of understanding, and Melanie spoke to this, the differences in our country historically and in this moment, in terms of what your background is and the unearned advantages that some of us have simply by where we're born or who we are born to. But there's also a joy that comes from actually engaging with the stories and lives of people that are not quote unquote the same, in both experiencing the wonder of learning about other lives and experiencing the challenge of encountering stories that are different than our own, whether that is through the pages of a book or a television show, or, you know, even better in terms of feeling comfortable actually building friendships and having relationships that might seem like they're crossing lines and then begin to create connection. So joy and justice both are reasons, as well as that identity formation, that I would certainly want to be having these conversations with my kids.
And I will add to that. I think that talking about race and ethnicity with children from a very early age is important, because it helps to add to what Amy Julia just said, the joy of discovery. Children have eyes and they can see that we are all different. We look different. We speak different. We have different dialects. I remember when my children were younger, they don't have grandparents. Both sets of grandparents were deceased when they were born. And we went to a church service and they saw very obviously older people and were asking so many questions about what's wrong with them. Because at a very early age, when children see things or people that are different from them, they assume that there's something wrong with the other. So that was a very early indication to us that we need to have these conversations with children young, so that they realize that just because someone doesn't look like you or walk like you, or in this case with the elderly, stand tall or have the energy level that you have, doesn't mean anything is wrong with them. And so we begin to teach our children about diversity and the beauty of diversity. And there are all different kinds of diversity, although I understand this question tonight is about race and ethnicity. But if we can start to talk to children as early as we can about the beauty of diversity, it removes the stigma that is inherently there. And so I think it's really important, as a person of color who lives in a suburban town, to me, it's very important that we teach our children about diversity. So it's not some of the stereotypes that are, why do you live in Newtown? You should live in Danbury, as one example of things that have been said to my children because of what they look like and because of their race. So starting early, as young as we can, to recognize the differences, but also appreciate and celebrate the differences.
Thank you. I have a couple things to add. I mean, one thing, Melanie, as you said, some people do have to talk about it. And for our family, we do. And especially as my son gets older, Carrie has a son who's older. It becomes, to have a dark-skinned son in a predominantly white environment, there's a lot of talking that you do. One, especially because Ridgefield is, for the most part, a safe community, building an awareness in that child that not every community is like this, and there's certain behaviors they have to be aware of. Even if all their white friends are acting a certain way, they can't. These are conversations that we have in our own home. It starts very young in that. If any of you have seen a picture of my family, my husband's Puerto Rican, but he looks white. And for my younger daughters who are dark skinned like me, anytime he goes into school, it's a little surprising for their classes to see Carolina with a white dad or Sophia with a white dad. And there will be comments made about that. So, when we're thinking about how do we even bring up these conversations with our kids, you can talk about those things. If you have a friend of your child who has a family like me, you can say, tell me about their family, and did you meet Carolina's dad that day? And what did you think? And just see where they go with that. I think you can be even more specific. Now, for me, I've had to talk to my child about, when kids say this to you, how are you going to respond? because I've seen it catch them off guard at different points. And almost there's a sense of embarrassment for some versus the other. So these are conversations that we have to have. And one thing that has stuck with me after speaking with this deacon, who actually his brother was Emmett Till's best friend. We were talking about different acts of racism that occurred. And I said, I don't think they learned, these kids who were a part of that, I don't think they learned it at home. And he said to me, they may not have learned it at home, but their families also didn't talk to them about how to respond to those things when they see them. And that is also a really good place to start when we're talking about where to have these conversations. So I would love to hear from Melanie and Amy Julia. How do you even begin? We know the importance of having them. How, for a teenager, how do you start talking about this in a way that feels organic for your child?
I mean, for me, the news is certainly a source of conversation. Even better, obviously, Nero, to your point, if there is something that comes home from school or from a book they're reading or discussing, or from, something that happened on a sports team. But if those are not coming to me, that sense of the outside world is right there. And so I am pretty, I do raise their awareness about especially the various news events that come up that have to do with race and justice, but also try to have conversations that bring that back to our community and to our lives, even if it doesn't, because it can really easily seem to them to be far away and distant, but to recognize the parallels. So that's how I start, but it is typically me taking some measure of initiative to bring this into our conscious and regular conversation.
I agree with Amy. I much prefer the natural opportunities that arise throughout the course of our lives to talk about these things. And I find too that we all make mistakes. We all use words, terms that are outdated, or we all make assumptions based on biases. And I try to both point out when I've done that, if I've done that in front of my kids, or maybe I'll share a story about something that I caught myself doing or thinking, or, when my children may say something in conversation that has a flavor of being misinformed or uninformed, I bring it up with them. And something that I tell them, this comes from, but I'm a psychologist. I'm primarily a cognitive behavioral psychologist, but I also incorporate a lot of evolutionary psychology in my work. And I am really interested in how the parts of the brain and how they're designed to work influence the behaviors that we see people put out. And a lot of this interpretation of other as bad or scary has an evolutionary underpinning to it. It used to be much, much more important than it even is now to identify who was part of your group and who was not, both in terms of people, but also animals and environmental threats. And so there's a very deep, very old part of our brains that categorizes. It categorizes anything new. It tries to put new ideas into boxes of things that we're already familiar with. And it's something that we've all carried into our present times, and yet we don't need to rely on that as much as was evolutionary necessary hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And so when I approach my kids, if I've caught something, I usually say to them, hey, it makes sense that you might have said that, or I totally get why that came out of your mouth that way. Let me give you a different way to think about this, or let's talk about this from this perspective or that perspective. And so I find, like Amy Julia said, if I'm looking for opportunities that arise in news stories or in emails that come home from the high school principal about incidents that have happened at school, or again, in comments or mistakes that I've made or things that I've said, I found that there's a pretty rich number of opportunities for me to jump in. And sometimes my kids welcome it and sometimes they shut it down. And that's okay, because I know that there are going to be more opportunities that will come.
Thank you, Melanie. And I do think those emails that come home from school, it's easy to read them and then move on, but especially when there are issues of race in those emails and incidents that have happened at the high school, and it's been pretty consistent. Every year there's one or two. Those are great starting points to have those conversations with your kids and ask them about it. I'm going to move on to the next question. I'm going to go to this question on microaggressions because this is a topic that can be difficult to understand, but something that the kids are very much aware of. And the question is, how do I help my kids understand microaggressions and how are they harmful? As well, how do they speak up against them? I'm thinking specifically of things that kids often view as no big deal, such as commenting to Asian friends that they must be good at math or sharing racially charged memes. This is a big one in our community now, the sharing of racially charged memes, text, comments such as that. Carrie, would you talk a little bit about microaggressions and just would you define it as well so people can understand what it looks like?
Absolutely. I was going to start there because to talk to our kids about microaggressions, we need to be clear as to what that means. They're subtle, oftentimes unintentional actions or comments or memes or texts that perpetuate long-standing stereotypes. They can be very hurtful to individuals, to groups of people. So the example that was in the questions we received about you're Asian, you must be good in math is an example of a microaggression. I can't even, this hits very close to home because there have been several microaggressions that have been coming at one of my children in the last, 4 or 5 months. And very through text and through social media, through Snapchat and whatnot. And realizing that, well, you are this race and you are this gender, therefore you must fill in the blank. And to the point of it bordering on bullying, right? And what happened, unfortunately, this is my son, is he started to believe it. And he started to believe, well, I must be stupid, or I must be fill in the blank. Am I going to end up like most men in our race? Am I going to? And it is taking a lot of time to kind of undo some of that and to teach him what microaggressions are and to teach him how hurtful they can be. And so I know I'm all over the place, but this one certainly hits close to home. Subtle, unintentional actions or comments that perpetuate stereotypes about individuals, groups, races, or ethnicities. And it happens in positive light, you're Asian, you must be good in math. But what about the child who's not good in math and who feels like then he or she has to live up to that? And it, again, I think, Melanie, you said this earlier, when we make mistakes, how many times has that happened with us where we perpetuate a stereotype? Owning that and being able to go to our children and say, you know what? I think that I've done this too. I think, oh my gosh, and I think this is how I've done it. And being able to talk to our kids about, we're not perfect, let's work on this together, has been very successful, at least in mine.
Thank you for sharing that, Carrie. And just a couple other examples that people may have heard of microaggressions to illustrate it. It's some of the examples that are widely used. If you look up the definition of microaggression, is seeing someone who looks threatening, they might be of another race, and crossing the street just based on how they looked, or holding your bag close to you. That's one of those actions. It's a negative microaggression. Whereas, the example we used about Asians being good at math, I've actually benefited from that. I'm not very good at math. So there are some that are far more detrimental, and those are the ones that we've talked about. But would either of you like to say something about microaggression, Amy, Julie, or Melanie?
Yeah, I did have just two thoughts. One is in terms of why we would like how we would help our kids understand that, because I do think, as far as how the question was worded, it is often for kids and possibly adults to think, is that really that big of a deal, right? Like to be dismissive of those. And I have two thoughts there. One is that I was doing a podcast interview with a older Black author named Patricia Raybon, and she's done historical mystery writing. So she's done a lot of historical investigation, and we were talking about her most recent book. And in it, she just made this comment about the fact that in America, her experience and a lot of the research she's done is that although we have a history, and what gets into the news are these really big deal overt racist acts, and we do have examples of that, her everyday experience as a Black woman who's now, I think, in her 70s, has been one of casual racism. And that was just a really helpful phrase for me, and one that I felt like I could talk with my kids about: casual racism. And microaggressions are casual racism. And so we might put them in a category different than the overt racism of what we see when we encounter violence or brutality in the news. And yet they are all of a piece, and we don't want to be a part of that. And why not? Because it's unjust, because it's dehumanizing our fellow human beings and citizens and friends, and on down the line. So there's all of that. The second thing I will say is that within all of that, one of the dangers for all of us as parents is expecting ourselves or our kids to achieve a standard of perfection. So having perfect language, having perfect attitudes, having perfect behavior. And what we also want, even in having these conversations, is modeling what it means to say the wrong thing, to make a mistake. And I've been on the encountering side of this when people have used derogatory language around people with intellectual disabilities. And in some cases have come back to me and said, I know I said that thing, and I'm really sorry. And that has been incredibly meaningful to me, which helped me to recognize that when I say something that I later realized was a microaggression, was something that maybe in the past I would have said, oh, it was no big deal, maybe they didn't even notice. That's actually an opportunity for me to go back and say, hey, when I said that thing, I'm really sorry. And so trying to give our kids not a standard of perfection in this, but a lot of grace as far as how relationships are built and how we can encounter one another. And yet also saying, and when you know that you have done something that might have been hurtful to a friend, there's an opportunity to go back and apologize for it. So casual racism and not perfectionism are my two thoughts on microaggressions.
And that's really helpful, Amy Julie, especially I think if they can see that it's okay to make a mistake, if we normalize making a mistake, but also normalize the repair, going back and being accountable for that mistake, and a willingness to learn. I love how Brene Brown always says, I'm not here to be right, I'm here to get it right.
Mhm.
And it just gives us an openness to saying, we're not going to know, even as parents, we're not going to have all the answers, but we're going to learn with you on how to get it right. And that may require making mistakes, taking accountability, and asking for help and direction. Melanie?
Oh, sorry.
Who was that? Go ahead, Carrie.
Sure. I just wanted to that point, I just want to share a story of something that actually happened when we moved to this town. My husband was out for a run, and it was winter. It was a day like today, actually. And he had his hoodie on. So here's a dark-skinned Black man running in Newtown with a hoodie on. And one of our neighbors saw him running, and quickly, it was very obvious to him that they were suspecting he shouldn't be there. And they went to the other side of the street. They ran into their house. About 2 or 3 weeks later, he was running again, and it wasn't as cold, and he didn't have his hoodie on. And they looked at him again, and they appeared a little less suspicious, I guess is a good word. And about 2 weeks after that, they ran into him in the local grocery store, and they said, do you live on such and such a road? And he said, yes. Do you run? He said, yes. And it was a husband and a wife, and they just felt horrible. And in the middle of the grocery store, apologized to him and admitted that they were doing a little profiling based on what he looked like and how he was dressed, and invited him over for dinner. He did not go, but he came home and had a conversation with me and the kids later that day. And that is, it's all of these moments when we can learn from these situations, talk about it, process it. And now, while I'm not going to say we are best friends with our neighbors, we are very cordial. We get along. We've done neighborhood potlucks and stuff like that. And they have grown and we have grown. But in talking to the kids about that whole situation, it was, this is what happened. This is how Dad felt. Dad had a choice. He could have reacted in a very angry way. He could have ignored it and stuffed it down and just not did anything, because this is always going to happen. But instead, he stood in the grocery store and talked to them, and then came home and talked to the family. And I think that is how we learn from these things, and how we grow from these things, and how we get it right. To Naro's point and Brene Brown's point, that's where progress is, and that's where growth lies.
Melanie.
I get the opportunity in my work often with high schoolers to they'll bring me like screenshots of text exchanges or social media exchanges. And especially among the kids that I see that go to smaller or maybe private schools, they've gotten in trouble for participating in some sort of a text exchange that usually has some sort of a racial charge to it or a misogynistic charge to it. And they'll say to me, usually we're working through, what it feels like to have gotten in trouble, and they're afraid, to let their parents know. But we take a look at the content too. And, I'm often able to say to them, if they've shared something, especially to speak to the question that started this whole conversation about sharing a meme, I'll be very explicit and I'll say, let's talk about why that was supposed to be funny. And the first reaction is always, well, no, it's not actually, it's not really funny. Yeah, okay, understood. You understand that now, but let's talk about where this might have even come from. And a lot of times when we end up with a sentence that says, well, it's based on the idea that all Black people blank, all men blank, all white people blank. If you've got that word all in there, chances are pretty good that whatever it is that you're looking at or that you're speaking about is inappropriate. And so I help these kids look for keywords and key messages, in some of these exchanges. And unfortunately, this is happening after the fact. So the microaggressions or the outright macroaggressions have been committed. But in an effort to not do these things again, we talk about where did this go wrong and where did this derail? And we sort of talk about like the social media equivalent of the carpentry rule about measure twice, cut once. You need to look at what you're typing, what you're sharing more than twice before you decide to hit that send or that post, or because that stuff can't be taken back easily. And so it's really important to take a step back before you do and consider, why is this funny? Or why is this a thing? Why did this become a saying? And look for generalities and stereotypes in the content that you're engaging with.
That's a really good example. And I think so much happens with these kids on text through direct messaging, and things are said very fast that kids are not thinking about. One thing, I'll just bring this close to home that I hear a lot, and I hear this from my kids at the high school, is the use of the N-word by white kids, calling each other this word as a joke, even within kids of color using that word. And that's a difficult situation, but it's one that we have to talk about at home if we hear it. Like Carrie said, the impact of using these words and perpetuating these stereotypes in these communities. It may seem funny or fun because they all think it's funny. They all think all of this is funny, but how it can have a harmful impact in the way that we think about people, the way we treat people. These are conversations that have to start at home. And it's hard for a kid to stand up to their friends. One thing I'm realizing more and more, because we live in a town, and I'm speaking to a lot of the educators right now, where we talk about being an upstander, not a bystander. That's a very common terminology at our school at Branchville, which is great. But what kids also have to learn is that being an upstander will lose friends. You will lose friends. It is hard. It is not just a noble act that seems like the right thing to do. Because when you see kids doing things to other friends that seem fun or funny, for you to speak against that, you have to recognize that it's going to be difficult for you. And we need to prepare our kids for that. And the other piece that I think is really important, and I see it with girl drama in middle school, like not to stereotype, but it's real, is the kids who stay silent. We need to let the kids know what that does well, that in silence there is complicity. So no, you may not have been saying something hurtful, but in staying silent in those moments, you're also contributing to the conversation. So that's something that I don't think we talk about enough. And I've noticed it more and more over the last few years and just want to mention it. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next question. I'm going to try and get 2 more questions on race before we move to identity, just being cognizant of the time. This is an important question, especially in a community like ours. And what are some ways I can talk to my white kids about their privilege that will help them understand it without making them feel overburdened by guilt or make them feel bad about who they are? Amy, Julie, you want to start with that?
Sure. Yeah, so I think the term privilege is a one that has become loaded within our cultural context, especially for white people. And I think I would start with trying to say, what do we mean when we talk about privilege? And what I mean when I talk about privilege is a set of unearned social advantages. Those words probably don't go very far with my teenagers, but perhaps unpacking them would. Okay, so what does it mean to have a social advantage? And that means when someone looks at me or looks at my name or looks at some identifiers that go along with me, I get an advantage that someone who does not have the same, whatever it is, would not. And, you know, I might, in this case, explain to my children that, for example, there have been a lot of studies that have shown that people with the name Amy Julia Becker will advance more quickly without even having met me or seen me if my resume is exactly the same as a person with a Black sounding name, whatever that might be. And so my name gives me an advantage, even when it comes to getting a job that I've done nothing to earn or deserve. So there are lots of different studies and examples along those lines. So again, the first thing I would start with was just like, what is privilege? But then that next part of the question is, how do you not take that awareness that I have an unearned advantage in our society? How does that not become something that fills me with shame or guilt? And I think for me, what that has meant is trying to equip my children with an understanding of the ways in which actually that privilege can cut them off from other people if they're not aware of it, and can connect them to other people if they become aware of it and say, instead of using this simply for my advantage, I want to use it to be in and creating diverse communities. So again, it can be a different kind of advantage if we allow our privilege to be what connects us to one another. And it also is, again, back to what we've been talking about as far as just what does it mean to be an upstander? What does it mean to have and take responsibility? For kids of privilege, that understanding of using the social power that comes with who they are for creating community, for breaking down barriers, that again is to their advantage in terms of the relationships that can come and the injustices that can even in small ways be overcome. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm trying to understand, have my kids have an understanding of their identity that is very much not based on shame and guilt, but that is also inviting them into a greater understanding of diversity and of relationships that are meaningful and of justice and of being able to be a part of something that is actually a transformative power in the world, but it's like the power of love rather than the power of social divisions because they ultimately, sorry, last thing I'll say, I know I've talked for a minute here, but the way I really came at this was in having a child who was born inside and outside of privilege. So having a child with Down syndrome who's been born into an educated, wealthy white family means that she is both on the inside and the outside. And when she was first born, and for the first couple of years, I really felt like my job was to break down barriers so that she could be like me. But over the course of her life, what happened in me was a recognition that there were so many ways in which I wanted to be like her, in which the community I had been introduced to of children and adults with intellectual disabilities offered something that connected with my humanity in a way that my homogeneous, wealthy, white, educated community was not offering. And so I wanted those barriers to be broken down, not so she could be like me, but so that we could learn from one another. And I did recognize that I had some power and privilege that could be a part of breaking down those barriers, but it wasn't so that I could stay the same. It was so that we could actually learn from and care for one another. And that was really transformative, and something that, again, we've talked a lot about in our family, is how do we participate in breaking down barriers, not so that we can stay in a position of privilege and power, but so that we can actually learn from one another in relationships of really like mutual giving and receiving.
I'll add too that I think that, addressing the shame and guilt piece is something I think we can actually lean into. It's an emotion, or those are emotions, or those are feelings, or those are states that if we're recognizing that our children are feeling or expressing those things, or we're feeling that ourselves, we can use that as a signal that, what does that mean? Well, that probably means that we're recognizing that something is not or was not right about how that came to be, or that it, quote unquote, shouldn't be this way. So not necessarily that I did anything specifically to create the privilege that I have, like Amy Julia said, unearned, but realizing that feeling of guilt is a signal that maybe I can be an agent of change in this discussion, or in this consideration, and take sort of along the lines of, wasn't necessarily my fault, but can be my responsibility in terms of making things better for people.
Thank you, Melanie. I'm going to move on to some of the questions that pertain to identity. We are going to have some time at the end to take questions. So if your question was not answered, please just ask it at the end or put it in the chat and I will read it. But we did get some questions on identity too. One was, how do I talk to a child who has questions and confusion about their gender identity when you think it's a phase or trendy? And I would also ask one of you to also speak to, how do we talk to our kids who may not be struggling with that, but know kids who also are going through this in terms of dealing with some of their own feelings about it and showing some compassion. Melanie, I know this is a big area that you work in, so would love for you to speak on this first.
Sure. There's a lot of components to this question. So if I miss, I'll start, and then everybody else can kind of jump in. In a very real way, we all already have a lot of the tools to talk to our children who have questions and confusions about their gender identity. I'm going to pause that piece about when you think it's a phase and trendy for just a minute. Talk to your children as you would talk to your gender questioning, or your children who are confused, much in the same way you would talk to your cisgender children. And cisgender being, internal gender identity matching the sex that they were assigned at birth. So if you would, you may not look at your cisgender daughter when she says, "Hey, I want to go prom dress shopping." let's go. And you might not say, oof, are you sure you should be wearing a dress to the prom? Are you sure? What are people going to think? You wouldn't say those kinds of things to your cisgender teenager. So if your gender questioning, gender variant, gender fluid child says to you, hey, I want to go shopping for a dress or a tux or a suit for prom, you can speak to that child in the same way you would if you were making the assumption that making assumptions based on them being cisgender. I'd love to be part of that with you. Let's go shopping, So you have a lot of the tools already. What happens when people talk about gender and gender variability is that they get very nervous. And so this is where that second piece comes in, where you think it's a phase and you think it's trendy. There certainly is more visibility to gender variable and gender fluid communities right now. Without going into a whole lot of professional speak, trust that there are ways that we can help children make a distinction between whether this is something that's real for them or they're following a trend. Happy to talk about that more later, but what I would say to you is if you think it's a phase and trendy, then you're probably worried. You're worried about the implications of this questioning for your child. And so you can keep the phase and the trendy worry to yourself, and you can address with your child the worries about how the world may treat them when they are presenting in a different way than, say, other people think they should. And so you can talk about it from a safety perspective and from an I care about you perspective. If it's a trend, if it's a phase, it will pass. If it's born of a desire to be something that they are kind of bucking what they're expected to be, if you lean in and you validate and you affirm, then they're not kind of bucking against you anymore, and it will pass. If it's something that's really genuine for the child, then it will persist. I think maybe, Narelle, I'll stop. There was a third part to that question and now I've forgotten it, but maybe I'll let somebody else weigh in.
Sure. It was also, how do you talk to your kids who are not struggling with this issue, but seeing it all around them?
I will jump in real quick and go back to the very first answer I gave at the top of the hour, listening and empathy. And I think that those two words come into play both here. If you have a child who's not questioning their identity, their gender, but has friends who are or knows people who are, and again, because it's different doesn't make it wrong, right? So if you have a child that is not questioning their own gender or identity, but knows someone who is, listen to them. Well, how do you feel about that? How does that make you feel when your friend says they want to change their gender or is dressing in a way that would be indicative of that, or is going through other processes, and listening to the parents who have kids who perhaps are questioning their gender. I'll say that I've had a few patients in practice who are early adolescents who thought perhaps they were gender fluid or non-binary or transgender, and listening and validating goes a long way. These kids are looking for validation, in my experience. And if we as parents and we as professionals don't offer them validation just by listening, they will go seek it out from somewhere else, and perhaps not a great source to be seeking it out from. So listening and understanding what's underneath that, and to what Melanie said, if it's a phase, perhaps it will pass. But listening and understanding and talking and validating is very, very important. So empathy and listening goes a long way with this, in my opinion.
I will just add that looking at our high school experience comparatively to our kids, it's a lot more confusing. Whether you're struggling or not, there's a lot to keep track of. There's many different pronouns. There's more potential to offend people by not getting it right. And again, to teach your kids to model asking for help and asking for information and apologizing and working on repair. And I think what I've seen with teens in this age is some of them are becoming desensitized to it, and they too question, is this a phase for someone or not? And my kids have come home talking about kids who identify as animals as well. There's a whole spectrum of this identity issue that our kids are faced with. And what I go back to with my own kids is treat them like a human being, how you would want to be treated, and know that some of these kids may be struggling. Some of these kids may not be understood. And maybe we can liken it to some area that our child has struggled in, maybe a different struggle. But how would you want someone to treat you in that way? That's how we need to be treating these kids. It's not our place to decide, as peers, is it a phase, or what is this, or what is that? Just show them some compassion, and we can model that for them. Amy Julie, do you have something to say, or should I go to the next?
The only thing I was going to say, which is really similar to what you all have said, is that especially from, again, being more in the disability world for these past 17 years, I have recognized that one way people can show respect, even without like full understanding, is to want to use language and that is what we would consider respectful language around our daughter and around other people who have disabilities. And that in this area, which I think so many people, as you just mentioned, are like confused around the terms and what words am I supposed to be using and what pronouns and things like that. And this goes back to Carrie's point about validation can come simply from listening, from being curious and asking questions, and from saying, really asking that question and modeling for our kids, what does it mean to respect the other person? Even if you still have questions, even if you're not sure what's going on, there can still be a real human to human respect for the other as a beautiful, beloved human being deserving of respect. And I think that language, again, can go a long way in demonstrating that.
Thank you. A quick question on that as well. What are the most important things not to say when your child expresses gender nonconformity or has questions? Are there any big red flags that we should avoid as parents in these conversations?
I think a fairly obvious do not say is sort of a flat out denial and shutting down. No, you're not. No, you're not wondering if you are really a boy. No, you're not. And then, as Carrie has said a lot during this hour, not to say too much. Let the teen do the talking. I get a lot of kids in my office a lot of teens who will come in and they'll sit down and they'll say, I'm non-binary, or I'm transgender. And I'll say to them, so I know what that means clinically. I could give you the definitions of those terms, but what does that mean for you? And then they explain to me what it means. They kind of define those terms for themselves. And so it's very important. And this is what they would do for you as parents as well. If you just use that opener about, well, I have some sort of an idea of what that means, but what does it mean for you? And then whatever they tell you, you affirm, you believe, you accept, and you can feel free to not act like an expert, because you likely aren't, unless you happen to be part of one of the LGBTQ communities yourself. And even then, you're an expert on your own experience, and let them guide and lead the conversation.
Thank you for that, Melanie. A couple, we're almost at the time where we're going to start taking questions. There was another question that someone asked, so I would like to put it out there. And they were talking about, really all it said was homosexuality among Christians. And, there are a couple of us who just wanted to comment on that. But again, coming from that side to being involved in my faith, in my family, we talk about compassion. We talk about exactly what I said, treating someone like a human. and loving them, showing them love and compassion. So that's our stance in that area, but would love for the rest of you to share.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. I have been, well, I think that at least the popular understanding of a lot of churches and Christian communities is a popular understanding of rejection of gay people and of gay marriage and of multiple different aspects of having a identity as a gay person. And what I would really love for people to understand, both on the parental side and in terms of talking with kids, is that there's actually a real range of understanding among Christians when it comes to homosexuality. And there certainly are churches and Christians who would have a posture, and even this has a lot of variability of rejection, whether that's rejection of behavior or rejection of identity. But there's also a whole other side of churches, whole denominations, who understand what the Bible says and who practice in a very different way that is actually very affirming of people who identify as gay in terms of marriage, in terms of being in leadership and these other things. So there's a real range. And I think when we're having these conversations with our kids, one of the things that's happening, especially in those adolescent years, is often a somewhat dichotomous thinking, right? It's either right or wrong. It's either left or right. It's one or the other. And helping them to recognize that actually so many of our questions and concerns do exist on spectrums, and whether that's a spectrum of gender identity, a spectrum of sexuality, a spectrum of opinions on a topic, a spectrum of political views. And one of the things that I think has happened because we have such a polarized society is we only see the poles. We only see the very vocal, strong opinions on the very far edges of these different viewpoints, when often many of us are in what might seem like a more murky middle because we have lots of questions still and we don't always know exactly what we think. But I think exposing our children to some of those moral questions, to some of those places where people disagree, but they might be mad at each other, or they might not be. And all of those things are actually can be really helpful and healthy. All that said, certainly, Nero, I would underscore your point on compassion and love. And that is absolutely what I want to be explaining to my kids. But I also want them to know that, yeah, there are within the Christian faith, this is true within Judaism, it's true within many other religions as well. There's a spectrum of perspectives on what it means to be gay. And we could explore that, and we could explore why, and even try to do that with compassion. So again, I hope that would communicate to my child if they were asking questions about faith and their own sexual identity, or anyone else that they are in relationship with. I hope I would be able to communicate, again, compassion, acceptance, validation of who they are and the questions they have. But I would also want, in topics like that, to expose them to the fact that there are still lots of questions and different ways of approaching these questions, whether that's within a faith community or an intellectual community or a political community, which, we really are as a nation as well. So just giving them, letting them be the teenagers they are with the questions they have, and exposing them to some of the gray and challenging areas, I think, again, respects them and is a part of showing them some compassion and love.
That was such a great, comprehensive answer. I appreciate that. And I think that, like you said, it's true for so many areas. There's such a spectrum of beliefs and understandings, and we can explore that with our kids in a very sensitive, non-judgmental way, but also allowing them to see what's already there. Melanie, did you have something to add as well?
I think this topic, or this statement of homosexuality in Christianity, really points to this idea, or this fact, that we all operate in communities and contexts. And so, I think what you both have said in terms of showing love and showing compassion is so important. If I turn my thinking a little bit more to, but what if this is my kid? What if this is my kid who is expressing this difference that may not be welcomed in a certain context that I'm in or in a certain community that I'm in? What do I do? And, I think back to the research, there's not a single childhood or teen struggle that I can think of where the research says parents should not be supportive. The research says parents need to affirm and need to support and need to champion for their children. And so I sort of think about it as, sometimes you're going to have to be running defense for them in your context or your communities. Excuse me, if your child is expressing or embracing a difference that may be at odds with a belief system or a value system of that broader context or that broader community. And that can be very, very difficult, and that's, I think, one of the hits that we've signed up to take when we've become parents, is that we may need to be that force that stands between, say, a disapproving great uncle and our transgender child, or a political rally and our gay child, or a white supremacist gathering and our Black child. We need to be that barrier while we are raising these kids, so that we teach them to become the barriers for themselves. And this question is something that applies to everybody, regardless of privilege or status. We all have identities, and there are places in this world where not all identities are welcome, or where every identity is not welcome. And really recognizing that we might have to be the barrier for a long time for our kids. And that if you do find yourself in that position as a parent, there's a lot of support that exists for parents when we're talking about any kind of topic or any kind of difficulty for children, to help you be that barrier they may need.
Thank you, Melanie, for sharing that. I'm going to open the talk to questions. If you have questions, you can either unmute yourself and ask the question, or put it in the chat. I'm going to be looking at the chat right now for the next 10 minutes or so. And if no one has questions, we were also given some other general questions about teens and talking to teens that I think are relevant for our community, especially. So I can ask those questions as well. But why don't you let me know if anyone has questions out there specifically that we can answer? Now's your time. We got a lot of good people who can answer you.
Nero, there's one that popped up sort of in the middle of the chat here, so it may not be visible to everybody. How do we draw teenage boys into conversations and family activities when they'd rather be on their own on social media?
That's a good one. And I think Carrie spoke to that at the beginning. And I don't know if that woman is still on the call, because I looked to message her to tell her that. But yeah, I don't think she is anymore. But Carrie did talk about that, just engaging with them in the things that they like to do. And even just being there, sitting next to them, your presence can be the gateway to the connection that you're looking for to draw them out.
My teenage clients hate that I say to both them and their parents that it's not just okay, but necessary to have sort of device blackout times, whether that be a dinner, whether that be a dessert, whether that be, excuse me, 15 minutes before school, which would then prevent the accessing social media and possibly set the tone or set the stage just for some passive connecting like Carrie was talking about, or give the opportunity for a little more conversation.
I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to ask one of the ones that were submitted to us.
Yeah, I think there was one that just went up in the chat.
Oh, great. Oh, perfect. How do we talk to our teens about the N-word? It was brought up, but would like to hear some advice.
I think I can start with this one. I just had a little bit of a glitch with my computer. Sorry about that. I think Nero brought up earlier that kids are using the N-word, both white children and Black children, almost as a term of endearment, or as a it's a slang word that, oh, but it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. And I think where we can start as parents and educators is explaining the connotations that word has and has had historically, and explaining that while you may not mean harm by it, this is what's associated with that word historically. What is the N-word meant? The N-word was a term given to Black slaves. Given to Black slaves as inferior human beings. So you may be using it in jest and laughing with your friends, and your friends aren't upset when you use that word, but this is the connotation. So what are some other things that we can discuss around that word? So I think giving a historical context is important, and then explaining the microaggression in it, right? Or macro in some cases. You may not mean harm by it, but, and opening the door for conversation. I think starting there is what I would suggest.
Anyone have other thoughts on that?
For my particular white children, my husband and I have always tried to set a tone in our house where we kind of choose our battles, and we leave a lot to our children's discretion, though we have raised them with some non-negotiables. And from a sort of a lighter perspective, for example, they've been allowed to choose their sports and their activities, except they also were both required to learn how to swim. That was a non-negotiable in our house, that you learn how to swim. And I bring that up because in my house with my white children, the way that we approach the N-word is that it's non-negotiable. You don't use it. You as a white boy don't have any ownership of that word. You don't have any history with that word. There are many other words that you can use if you are talking about your friends or your bros. But given who you are and how you walk through this world, you don't have rights to that word. Now, I completely recognize that I don't control what comes out of my children's mouth. I don't control any children. And so are my kids going to use that word? Possibly. Have they? And I don't know. Possibly. But I've made it pretty clear, and my husband as well, we've made it pretty clear that in my house and in the way we speak to people and about people, that's not a word that we have any right to speak in our vocabulary. And so therefore, I expect them not to use it.
Thank you, Melanie. I think it's also really important to remind them that word still is used to harm in many communities in our country. And we do not want to be complicit in that type of ideology. And we can explain that to them in their own words, because they're looking at it here as very innocent and joking, but it is not always the case, even now. There was another question that popped up that we can get to now. Do you see a trend in the gender identity arena? It seems so prevalent in the teen population in recent years, and it has exponentially risen. In your experience, and how much would you say is authentic? Same question about sexuality, sexual identity.
There's a lot more visibility to gender variability and gender questioning. I think some of that comes from this generation of teenagers not being so wedded to stereotypes, and also becoming more aware of what's expected of them based on the gender they are assigned at birth, and really not being comfortable with traditional gender roles. And so I think there's a lot more openness in exploring both gender and sexuality, which are related but separate things. In terms of trending, I I don't love that word because it implies sort of a shallowness to what's happening among our kids. And I think that for a lot of kids, for most kids, it is a very deep exploration of who they are and who they feel like they are internally and how they feel like they want to be read by the world. And so what they put out there for their gender expression. That being said, there are some markers of true or persistent gender fluidity that we look for in the professional arena. We look at persistence, insistence, and consistence. So, how long has a child been expressing gender-related ideology or using their physical persona to express gender? How insistent are they on being referred to or named in certain ways? How consistent is that belief over time? And how much distress does it bring them? And so these are things that we, if we're talking clinically, that we look at. And something that I would love to put out there, there's a lot of misconception right now that kids can, have one thought that maybe they're gender fluid or maybe they're transgender and march themselves up to the door of an endocrinologist and walk out with a prescription for hormones. And this is just not how the system works. And I won't go into full detail about what all is involved, but I will say that there is a lot involved. And so what we find is that not all kids, teenagers, adults are interested in pursuing the full spectrum of services that are available, both in terms of social interventions and medical interventions related to gender. And the process doesn't move as fast as the media sometimes likes to say it does. And so there is plenty of time to be affirming, validating, connecting without worrying about permanent changes to external body or internal body when we're talking about gender.
Thank you, Melanie. Are any other questions? Well, I think we're just about at our time and just want to respect everybody's time. And on behalf of all of us, we want to say thank you for attending this talk and for the willingness to have these hard conversations and also to have them with your teenagers. And I will say that even as professionals in this field, we all struggle with some of these conversations. So know that you're not alone there. And like I said, we're not here to always be right, but we're here to learn to get it right. And we're going to learn from each other as we continue to have these conversations. So thank you for being here tonight. And thank you to RPS for sponsoring this talk as well. We appreciate your commitment to having these conversations.
And a special thanks to Nero for being our moderator tonight. You did an amazing job. My name's Kathleen Murdoch. I'm the co-PTA president at the high school. And we were just delighted to be able to have these experts come in tonight. A few of them are parents at our high school, so we feel really grateful to have them participate, but also having Carrie and Amy Julia join us. It was just really special. Thank you. I also wanted to reach out to or send my thanks to Angela Rice and Lynn Everdell from the Ridgefield Council of PTAs for helping co-sponsor this event. The Ridgefield Library also has been amazingly helpful in putting this together, and we really hope to make future events possible. I just put in the chat a feedback form, and I'd love to have any feedback, all feedback, because we really would like to have more of these conversations in the future. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you especially to our panelists.